I just want to welcome everybody on Zoom. We're getting our first speaker. We're asking her to break away from the coffee, soda, and cookie bar and come on in. So Arthi will be with us in a second or two, and then we'll get the show on the road.
Good. Let me just make sure that everything opens all right. Yeah, I know. I checked earlier and then I was like, oh, but they must have figured it out in the previous section. It is? Did you, maybe because I tried open with before and it I couldn't seem to get it as an option.
What happens is that it tends to, okay, so yeah, it always puts it in the wrong spot. Where'd my Adobe go? Shit. No. What happened to it? Well, it should be on there. Where'd it go? Well, maybe we don't have it.
I'm going to search for it and see if I can just type in like Acrobat or.
It's supposed to have Acrobat on it. It had it on last week. Can you just show it just regularly?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Where are you?
This one. And let's see, I guess, how we can make it bigger. Okay. Don't know how this will impact the buttons. We'll find out.
No, I think all you have to do is just be in it and just go up and
okay,
down. Or maybe not.
Got it.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, okay, you just got to go over that. Okay.
Thanks to everybody who's joining us online. We'll be a few minutes.
How's that? Okay. Just use this to go up and down.
Okay, great. All right.
So welcome everyone to this session on the Great Depression. We've got 3 speakers in person, 2 discussants in person, and 1 discussant on Zoom.
Great, thanks. So thanks everybody for being here and to the organizers for putting this on the program. So this is joint work with Katherine, Eriksson, and Gary Richardson, and it's very early stage work. And it's going to be very much a results so far type of presentation. So we're very open to feedback and would happily take any suggestions. So today's paper, can you see that okay? My scrolling is tough. Okay, great. So this is a part of a larger NSF-funded project on the macroeconomy and labor markets in the past, kind of looking from the 19th century to the present. And this agenda both includes generating some really exciting new panel data on local economic conditions, which I'd be happy to talk about with anybody in the coffee break, et cetera. But it also involves several papers on the consequences of the Great Depression for individuals and cohorts in particular, and thinking about long run effects in particular, since that has previously been quite difficult to do kind of prior to this like linking revolution. Today's paper in particular, among these many kind of ways that we think about the cohort effects of the Great Depression, is actually going to be focusing on the phenomenon of labor market scarring. So particularly thinking about, what are the consequences of entering the labor market during this, big national crisis. And so our kind of main questions are, what sorts of harms, if any, are associated with undertaking this sort of like a really critical transition in your life and your career during bad times? How persistent are those early career penalties over the career and over the life course? And why do these effects arise? What are the mechanisms? And what scope do people have for adjusting and offsetting some of these adverse effects that they might face? So luckily, because we have, this great audience of historians, many of you don't need, convincing as to why the Great Depression is intrinsically interesting or important. But kind of speaking more broadly, we think that this is an important set of questions because, and I think this is particularly on our minds in light of COVID-19 and things like that. But, young workers are often the ones that are most vulnerable and have the least margin for adjustment during recessions. And harm to their careers early on can persist, at least in theory, with extreme costs both to those cohorts and to their households and to society at large. In terms of foregone earnings, innovation, output, household level investment, things like that. I'm also, for the sake of time, going to be a little bit light on the kind of broader literatures that we're a part of, but despite the kind of great work on labor in the Great Depression, particularly thinking about cohorts in the past, we actually know relatively little about this particular phenomenon of scarring over the life course in the context of the Depression, which is a pity because obviously this is one of the most consequential events that these cohorts probably faced, and one that may have had implications for the kind of broader economic development of those generations. And then, speaking to a kind of modern literature on this phenomenon of labor market scarring, a lot of it, which focuses on the 2008 recession, is obviously only able to really speak to effects about 10 to 15 years out. And what's really striking is that despite the fact that this literature is a little bit mixed, there is some evidence, kind of increasing evidence that these kind of career damage may persist kind of where modern data leave off. And so what we'd really like to do is be able to push forward and to kind of observe people over their entire career so that we can see the kind of effects of, potential mismatch or job ladder effects or, early career earnings penalties that might follow people throughout their lives. We really want to see them play out over the life course and perhaps even intergenerationally. And then finally, parts of that same literature tend to focus on, if not looking at the 2008 recession, then they're looking at kind of small year-on-year unemployment fluctuations, or they're exploiting things, for identification's sake, like mass layoffs or Bartik-style shocks, which are kind of fundamentally local phenomena. And we, think it's kind of interesting to think about how the margins for adaptation might change when you have a really, really large shock and a national rather than a kind of hyper-localized shock. And so today, what I'm going to share with you guys are the short and medium run effects. So we're kind of thinking effects about 7 years out from this initial shock. But coming soon, and I think what's really exciting about this work is we're going to be able to think about the long run effects throughout the kind of life course and through the end of the career. And so that's kind of coming later on. So what we do is estimate the career stage effects of the Great Depression on labor market outcomes about 7 years on from the initial shock. And we do this basically in what amounts to about a triple difference type of framework, where we are kind of looking at the effects on depression, i.e. 1930s cohorts, relative to the placebo 1920s cohorts, amongst groups that are experiencing more or less severe contractions, and depending on the kind of career stage they were at the time that they experienced these contractions. So you can think about it, the three differences as, the first is a spatial difference depending on the severity of the Great Depression. The second is a temporal dimension, which is, whether you're a member of the 1930s cohort or not. And then finally, there's this career stage dimension, which is what age were you at the time, that the shock took place, and kind of how did this expose you, at least through labor market entry channels, to these kind of adverse conditions. And so to look at this question, we generate large-scale longitudinal microdata by linking full count historical censuses, so the 1920 to the 1930, and then the 1930 to the 1940. This gives us a sample of a little over 8 million US resident men of all races. And we are particularly interested in those aged 9 to 18 in the third year of the initial decade, which is how we're defining kind of the worst of the shock. And as far as career stages, we're dividing this 9 to 18 group up into those kind of at highest risk of entering the labor force, those kind of at medium risk, some of them were entering, some of them might have had some margin to adjust, and then those that were at the lowest risk of exposure to this kind of career transition. So those were 9 to 12. And then, of course, we pair this with county level data on the severity of the Great Depression, which in this version, we're kind of thinking about as the extent of decline in retail sales per capita from 1929 to 33. So to give you a brief overview of the findings, relative to those least exposed to immediate labor market entry pressures, there is some evidence of career scarring about seven years on, which is to say that the older children are facing kind of worse outcomes than the very youngest cohorts. On the flip side, you can think about that as actually being kind of that the youngest cohorts seem to have substantially more margin to adapt and adjust, and observe the conditions and react to them. The youngest cohorts, those who were 9 to 12 years old at exposure, are consistently distinct from the older cohorts, including those past age 16, after which point there's very little age gradient in the effects through all the way to middle age. And these youngest cohorts almost invariably have better outcomes than their older counterparts. But what's really striking, thinking about, not the scarring effect so much as the total Great Depression effects, is that on many metrics, these cohorts are also doing better than their non-depression counterparts. And this is especially the case for the very youngest groups. And those effects appear to be driven in large part by the disappearance of or movement out of low-paid jobs like farming, and the move upward to occupations that would ultimately offer this better kind of income path. So our main specification basically takes kind of a standard diff and diff type of form. So what we have here is, kind of the very baseline kind of main Great Depression effect equation. And you can think about this as being interacted fully with these with the age dummies for the three groups. So what we look at is the outcome at the individual level for an individual that lives in state S in county C at, in period T. And so kind of the main Great Depression effect is this severity times post measure. And then what I'll be showing you in most of the tables is, severity times post times a dummy for the two age groups, the two older age groups. So that everything will be kind of relative to what's going on for this 9 to 12 group. Again, for the sake of time, I won't really get into much to robustness and kind of placebo checks, but we do a number of those, and we feel confident that these are kind of reasonable ways to estimate our effects. So our main data is coming from the sample of longitudinal links. So we take men that are observed at age 6 to 15 in either 1920 or 1930 full count censuses. That's the control and the treated groups respectively. And then we match them to their future selves 10 years later in 1930 or 40. We're conceiving of treatment or the kind of placebo treatment as occurring in the third year of the decade, so 1933 or 1923, which means that basically you become treatment eligible at 9 to 18. And that's kind of how we're thinking about this. And of course, we realize that that's kind of a stylized way to think about this. And, when we have kind of higher frequency data that we're collecting as part of this NSF project, we'll be able to kind of shape this a little bit better and think more holistically about people's exposures over their early career. And then we kind of use the standard linking methods to generate this sample. And we end up with a little over 8 million men. Okay, so we begin by examining what is happening at the labor force participation margin. And what we see is that the youngest cohorts are substantially likelier to be in the labor force and are even likelier to be successful in finding employment. We might be worried about interpreting these results as being unambiguously positive. For instance, perhaps the crisis is, compelling families to pull their children out of school and to send them into the workforce. But as I'll talk about more when we get to the schooling results, that doesn't actually appear to be the case. Older teens are less likely to be employed, by and large, because they've withdrawn from the labor force, almost like a discouragement effect. And these results are robust to controls for broader structural change over this period. And if we strip out relief in public works employment, we see that the increase in employment among the youngest is largely a private or market phenomenon. For older teens, any of the modest overall gains in employment were because relief work propped them up or offset losses in private employment. Next, we turn to occupational income. Beginning with the unadjusted doc scores and moving to those that account for race, state, and urban-rural cost of living differentials. And what we see is across-the-board increases in occupational income, though again, the effects are more muted for older groups. And as we'll see in a moment, this appears to stem in large part from the shift out of jobs like laboring and farming that have lower occupational incomes. So we now want to start thinking a little bit about the mechanisms, occupational change, migration, schooling, things like that. And so what we see, if we kind of examine what kind of top line occupations these cohorts are entering, we see, an exodus from farming with relatively little in the way of age gradient. So this is kind of an age invariant phenomenon, it appears. And consistent with our employment and labor force participation results, we see a large reduction in non-occupational status with strong age gradients there. The youngest are most likely to see this fall in non-occupational. We see an increase in white-collar occupations, especially for the youngest, increases in skilled blue-collar work, especially for the oldest, and an increase in unskilled blue and non-farm labor for the youngest, although no real net effect for the oldest. So it seems like these youngest workers are really kind of leapfrogging ahead in terms of their occupational mobility. We look within farming. So obviously, the real farming result is that people are not entering farming. But within farming, among those who stayed, what we see is that the youngest cohort were most likely to move off their family's farm and work for wages for someone else. The older cohorts, in contrast, in counties that were severely hit, didn't reduce working on their family farms. Instead, they delayed starting their own farms, whether it was as a tenant or as an owner, and worked as hired hands. And I think in either case, we expect this apparent downward mobility within farming to pay off in the long run, since it's kind of ultimately loosening that cohort's ties to sectors and regions that would be declining over the subsequent decades. So I know I'm running out of time here. So what I might do is just kind of briefly say that our kind of main results with respect to migration are that kind of migration is increasing dramatically as a function of the Great Depression for these groups. And this is especially a phenomenon among the older children. And this increased migration propensity likely contributed to the results that we see on occupational income, because depression-induced migrants actually saw positive effects on occupational income. And while some of that is related to positive migrant selection, it was hampered, on the other hand, by the fact that depression induced migrants to choose destinations with slightly worse labor markets relative to non-depression migrants, kind of consistent with the kind of constraints that people face, making these big moves in a crisis. And even here, we find notable age gradients, with the youngest groups actually choosing worse destinations than the oldest ones. So finally, kind of thinking a little bit about schooling, you might think, were people, especially the youngest cohorts who were finding themselves in white-collar occupations and things like that, was it that they were staying back in school and gaining additional skills that positioned them better, when they weathered this crisis to enter better jobs? But that doesn't actually seem to be the case. It seems in all of this, it's both point-in-time estimates on kind of enrollment and cumulative estimates based on years of schooling suggest that there were decreases in human capital acquisition, most so for the youngest groups. And if we worry that early withdrawal from school and entry into employment for that youngest group was compelled by poverty, this doesn't appear to be the case, because in results that we don't show here, the effects are actually greatest for children of higher SES fathers and non-farmers and other people with better off circumstances. So it really seems to be that there's some sort of mechanism by which the youngest groups are able to kind of observe what's happening and make some sort of adaptation, take advantage of kind of opportunities. And we think that policy probably also really has a role in this, given the kind of changes in child labor policies with certain included industries, the kind of strength of unions that kind of enforce seniority systems that might have allowed people to kind of jump into these kind of more white collar occupations. Okay, so I know I'm out of time, so I'm just going to end on this slide. It gives a little bit of information on our ongoing work, in which we'll be kind of moving forward from these 1940 outcomes all the way up to the 1970s, all the way to the present. And that's going to give us a much richer and finer set of outcomes. It's going to allow us to kind of push past where modern literature has been able to talk about the kind of career effects of graduating into recession. And it's also going to allow us potentially to include women when certain aspects of this data become available. And I think that's going to be really valuable, particularly thinking about how households weather these sorts of shocks. And with that, thanks, and I welcome your suggestions and comments.
And now we have Shester from Washington and Lee. Thank you very much, Arthi.
Okay, I can't really use the mouse, sorry. So we're going to look at a slide and a half at a time. So I'm Katie Shester. I had the pleasure of reading this paper and telling you a tiny bit about my thoughts about it. To give you some kind of a very quick summary, what the authors are doing in this paper is they're linking millions of individuals across the 1920, 1930, and 1940 censuses to estimate the effects of growing up in the Great Depression on education and on labor market outcomes. And so their focus is on men who are 9 to 18 in 1933 at the trough of the Great Depression. And they're observing outcomes for these individuals in 1940 when they are 16 to 25 years old. So they are using they're estimating the effect of the Depression by using Great Depression severity in the county of residence in 1930. And then they implement a definitive strategy using 16 to 25-year-olds observed in 1930 as a control group, which they refer to as a placebo. So kind of quick reactions. It's such an important question. I don't think I need to tell this crowd that. It has, historical significance, just understanding the kind of enormous depths of the effects of the Great Depression. It has contemporary significance to help us understand the effects, the long-term effects of recessions on kind of future work. The data is extremely cool. I am very, very jealous of this data. And while it's a preliminary project, it's also very hefty, both in terms of outcomes and mechanisms. When they told me that it was a work in progress, I was not expecting a 48-page paper. There's a lot here. And so they look at labor force participation, employment, schooling, occupation score. They look at the role of migration and the role of agriculture. And it's really fascinating. So I have a few basic kind of clarifying questions. And one is what labor market scarring looks like for the sample. And I think that the title of having scarring in the title might be kind of more indicative of what's to come with the long-term effects. I know what labor market scarring looks like for people who are 40, but if we're looking at people who are still like in their late teen years, if they decide to not go to work but stay in school, is that scarring? It seems like a good thing, right? And so I'm curious kind of what the predicted outcomes in terms of schooling and employment are. I'm also curious about the choice of age bins. And so when I was reading this paper, since they used the age at 1933, I kept kind of trying to go back and forth between age in 1940 and age of 33 and age of 30. And so I made this little table for myself in my notes. But so they're lumping together 16 to 19-year-olds in 1940. But it seems like 16 to 19-year-olds, that's kind of a wide age range where some are really in school and some are not. And so it wouldn't surprise me if the employment and schooling outcomes for 16-year-olds and 19-year-olds were very different. And so I use this as an opportunity to download the 100% 1940 sample and play with it because, that's fun. And so you can see in this one graph kind of up top, you can see the percentage of men in school in 1940, the percentage in the labor force in 1940 by age. Clearly, these things are negatively correlated. If you look at the little table in the bottom right, I just looked at the percentage of my male sample who was in school in the labor force or combinations of the two. 43% of the sample was in the labor force, but not in school. 44% not in the labor force, but in school, right? And very few were yes, yes, or no, no. But I wonder, kind of related to scarring, if scarring was like that bottom bin of no, no, not in school, not in the labor force. I'm also curious about kind of the focus on the age at the trough versus kind of the age during the downturn. I guess I want to know kind of what's so special about the trough. I get like wanting to observe folks kind of after they have suffered a lot in the Great Depression, but kind of put differently, if like the trough happened to we didn't hit the trough till 1935, would you still be interested in the trough or would you still be interested in 1933? A couple of other questions about the control group or the placebo. My understanding is that they're using these folks who are 16 to 25 in 1930 to pick up life cycle trends. But I'm curious if those life cycle trends would actually be the same as the folks who were 16 to 25 in 1940. So were there things that might have been different for that other group, such as say World War I? I'm also curious about whether the outcomes of these individuals observed in 1930 were impacted by the Great Depression. And so, were their employment outcomes different when observed? That would obviously be problematic. I'm also curious whether the measure of Great Depression severity being the ratio of retail sales per capita in 1929 divided by 1933, if that was correlated with growth in retail sales per capita in the late 1920s. Because if like a big growth led to a big decline, then the big decline might actually be correlated with good things that had impacted the outcomes of this placebo group when they were coming up. Suggestions. I'm curious how much the placebo is doing. And so they report the difference, the post-time severity by age, but I'd really love to see those coefficients separately. I'm curious, kind of related to that, what the results look like without the placebo. Also curious to see what the results look like by age instead of age bins. You mentioned in the paper that you do the kind of event study analysis. I didn't see a table, but I'm sure that you have one. And then finally, I'm curious about education results. You show years of schooling and in school, and you only have in school in 1930, but once you're limiting it to 1940, you could also look at whether they finished the 8th grade or whether they finished the 12th grade. And those kind of like final outcomes I think might be useful. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Two of the best talkers I've ever met. They got a lot of material. Price, do you have a question? In case the Zoom audience can't hear the question, it was about including 1933 to 1935 data and 35 to 39 and New Deal as well. Do you want to step to the microphone and give a 10-second response?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a great point, and I think that gets at our kind of desire to kind of saturate the model with, not only the policy that may be orthogonal, correlated, but also the continuous measures of or precisely for that reason. But for the sake of this, really because as long as we base it not kind of discriminatory correlated. Right. Okay. Yeah. Got it. No, that's definitely not.
For the Zoom audience, Arthi said it's on her agenda, and I don't see any questions in the chat function, but if anyone on Zoom would like to put a question in the chat, that's great. We've still got a few minutes, and we have a hand up. Go ahead. That would be awesome. And if you could lean right up to the darn mic, instead of staying a comfortable distance away, I think it would really help our audience.
Okay, thank you. So my question was about this ongoing work. This is all fascinating. A question I've always had, and it seems like might be something to grapple with the ongoing work, is it always occurred to me that World War II probably very much reduces the log-run scarring effects of the Great Depression, that you have an event that means everyone gets a job and sort of everyone is starting over in 1945 in a way that is not generally true after recessions. And so I think it'd be really interesting, but I would be somewhat skeptical that any results one would get about log-run scarring in this context would necessarily tell one all that much about other recessions which aren't followed by periods in which you have sort of more than full employment.
Can I just get a sense from the Zoom audience? Were you guys able to hear that at all? Okay, awesome. So Arthi, you got a minute for a response.
Yeah, thanks. Your point is really well taken, and I guess it's something that we're going to look at to see kind of how it's analyzed. Because it's not just that thoughtful, it's like not just that there's that name just like center. And what's interesting is that folks kind of what are the different other things that really change. So what we think about those also quite taken.
Thanks very much. And I forgot to give Arthi's university at the beginning of our talk. She's joining us from UC Irvine. So thank you very much for the discussant, for the questions, and for our speaker. One more round of applause. Thanks. And now Sarah's here, Sarah Quincy from Vanderbilt, to fill us in on housing spillover effects. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, guys, I I'm going to try my best to see if there's a full screen because I feel like a hypocrite if I don't. Okay. Price, you're messing with my deeply held beliefs here. Maybe that's my goal. Then I get more than 15 minutes. All right. You can try. All right. So it's really lovely to be with everyone. This is the first time I've really presented this paper to live breathing people. So this is like very exciting. And it's also good to see all of you on Zoom. I value you as well. So today I want to start just like very broadly with why it is we might think about this connection between income and sort of housing spillovers. And I just want to start with the observation that, now housing is the biggest part of most households' asset portfolios, right? So outside of the top 10% of the wealth distribution, housing is really it for most people. And this is over the course of the 20th century being driven by both increases in home ownership and also increases in home value. And so what this tells us is for those people who are actually able to buy homes at any point, you're able to then leverage the stream of lovely capital gains to increase your wealth over time. And people have shown that then, again, conditional on owning a home, you see these real benefits to narrowing wealth inequality when housing price gains are actually outpacing the stock market, for example. But we know that, even though homeownership is important, it's not easy. It's shaped by a lot of stuff that goes on nationally. It's shaped by policy. It's shaped by all sorts of things. And so what I'm going to do in this paper is to try to think about the importance of homeownership and such things for housing wealth accumulation by thinking about income in particular and how it interacts with some of these market forces. Okay, so for this audience, so the Great Depression, bad. We know this, but what I want to sort of highlight here is that unlike income, which recovers back up to its 1940 levels by 1929 levels by 1929, the years are backwards, you guys get it. Housing prices don't. And you don't have to believe this house price index to know that housing markets are still in like a world of pain by 1940. And so, for this group of people, I think it's important to especially emphasize by thinking about the connection between income and housing wealth in the 1930s, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be speaking generally to this question of why there was such an incomplete housing market recovery, given the massive intervention of the federal government in housing markets. And sort of hopefully speak to these broader questions about the drivers of the dynamics of housing wealth inequality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my causal inference claim here is that I'm going to say that World War I veterans are going to be sort of my treated group. And the reason I'm going to do that is that they get this unexpected income shock during the 1930s, which I'm going to refer to as the Veterans Bonus of 1936. And I'm going to compare these World War I veterans to their similarly aged 1930 neighbors. And so the reason I'm going to do this is I'm going to soak up a whole bunch of stuff you might be worried about that's unobservable, that are related to things like preferences or something like that. And I'm going to compare these two groups, these two men, veteran and non-veteran neighbors, over time to get at this question of how income actually affects housing wealth formation, and then try to factor in variation across space to think about the importance of housing and financial spillovers. And what I find is that this windfall gain is super great for veterans. Compared to their pre-shock neighbors, eligible households, so World War I veterans in the data I'm going to be looking at here, are more likely to own their home. Those who own homes are going to own higher value homes. And if they weren't homeowners already, they're going to be much more likely to buy a house by 1940. So that's great. Veterans are thriving, but it turns out when you look at the variation in across housing markets and look at a really lovely sample of mortgage loans that Jonathan Rose shared with me very generously, what you see is that actually veterans are in some ways crowding out ex-ante similar households. And so what this tells us is that these guys are going to benefit. And if you look in 1960, they continue to benefit, it looks like. These credit frictions, these issues in housing and banking markets are going to sort of keep these veterans doing better just for a really long time. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean as I go forward here. So a lot of people in the audience, broadly speaking, have talked about housing in the 1930s. All I'm trying to contribute here is thinking about households. I want to think about the distribution of housing wealth here and the distribution of income to bring sort of a different lens. And in doing so, speak to a modern literature on sort of the combination of windfall gains and wealth outcomes to think about inequality.
And again, sort of for the history audience here, I'm going to be updating some parts of the World War I veterans literature, building off Josh Hausman's work to say, look, the veterans bonus is huge. Not only does it stimulate the economy, it really helps these guys over the long period. So even though World War I veterans look like their peers in 1930, which is what this literature has largely found before this, they do get one great thing, and it's the bonus, and it's going to really help them out. Okay. So I want to give you a little bit of background here on the World War I bonus and why it is we can compare World War I veterans to non-veterans and feel comfortable with it. So it's important to note that World War I is in a lot of ways the first modern draft in American history. So that means that it was selected via lottery. So most men in the U.S. Armed Forces were selected via lottery. They come back from the war and they were like, we would like some sort of compensation. You know, they got it after the Civil War. Why not us? Congress says, no, thank you. We would actually prefer tax cuts. And so they decide that they're going to defer payout of anything to World War I veterans until 1945, assuming by then they would manage to balance the budget. Nothing between 1924 and 1945 would at all affect the government's ability to balance its budget. So they passed this law in 1924 over presidential veto to pay out this thing, which is essentially a pension, in 1945. But by the start of the Great Depression, veterans are unhappy with this length of time until the payout. So in 1930, it's unexpected that they get some sort of benefit. It takes a lot of concerted effort and protest by veterans to get access to even a little bit of this money in 1931. And then by 1936, over another presidential veto, we get the payment of the bonus. And the bonus here you can think of as basically, on average, a year of per capita income for these veterans. We can't really tell how much each veteran got, but on average, it's about a year of per capita income in 1936. So it's sizable, and in 1930, it's unexpected. And so that's going to be a big part of where I'm going here. So you may be wondering, who are the men who are able to leverage this big benefit? And if you look at the 1930 census, they ask every man, you know, did you fight for the United States or not, and in what war? And so what you can see is that most of the men who are in 1930 report that they're World War I veterans are going to be between the ages of 32 and 38. And there is going to be this part of this question where you probably noticed that it's like way higher for white men than it is for men of other races. And so I'm going to focus on men who are between the ages of 32 and 38, and just keep in the back of your head that my sample is going to be disproportionately white. And so if you're thinking about other kinds of frictions that maybe matter in housing markets, I'm not going to be able to speak to all of them. I'm talking about mostly white men because of things that went on during World War I. So just to give you, proof that this is something that happened and people realized that there was a reason to use the veterans bonus to talk about housing, what you can see here is this is a newspaper from 1936, the day that the veterans bonus paid out. And you will notice there are these lovely, I guess I can use this. Okay. Veterans are going to purchase homes with their bonus bond money. They see this is a really big idea, and it's something that's really actively encouraged, not only by realtors, you guys are like, yeah, those guys want business, but also the FHA and the VA. People are really excited about the idea that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to really buy a home and while houses are relatively cheap. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the bonus. I want to give you a sense of where this identification strategy is going to come in, because I'm going to claim that this is a causal effect. And so you guys, your hackles are probably raised and I should defend myself. So what I'm going to do is use a nearest neighbor strategy here. I'm going to sort of use the fact that in the census, enumerators were supposed to go door to door. And so when we look on a census page, it is very likely that the households that are next to each other actually live next door to each other. And so what that's going to let me do, in combination with the fact that the bonus is sort of ex ante unanticipated, and the fact that a large history literature would suggest that World War I veterans look like their peers, are going to let me say that these are two households who made the same choices, not knowing what was going to happen, and then shock one of them. So what you need to do is believe that this is a good way to control for some of these issues. I'm going to do this by using Abramitsky-Bustan, Eriksson automated linking, nothing too fancy there. I'm just going to follow World War I veterans and their next door neighbors from 1930 to 1940. And I end up with a positively selected group of 500,000 men. So to fix ideas, sorry for everyone in the room, this is the best part of the presentation, I think. Here, let's explain why you need neighbors. So this top guy is Buster Keaton, famous silent film star. He was a World War I veteran. They asked this in the census. And you can see they also ask, how much is your house worth? Do you own your house? And a whole bunch of other things. His next door neighbor is Charlie Chaplin. another famous movie star. And so you could imagine that you would never, ever want to compare Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin to all of the rest of America, but they're probably a good counterfactual for each other. So I'm going to take those two men and I'm not kidding. This is the best part of the whole presentation. It's over now. So then you go and you follow them forward. So Buster Keaton actually has moved. He is still a homeowner. So in 1940, we see the same information. Charlie Chaplin has also moved. This is not related to the paper, but Charlie Chaplin is now next door neighbors with Fred Astaire. So if you're wondering, he has a preference for living by movie stars. So this nearest neighbor approach is supposed to sort of abstract away from a lot of these neighborhood-related differences in households. And then I'm still going to control for a lot of individual level things like age, number of children, occupational group, stuff like that you might think really matters. And so I have 3 sets of results here. I'm really only going to show you 2, given that I talked too long already. But I'm going to be using this census page fixed effect to try to convince you that this is a causal effect. And I'm just going to show you here that the change over time, so using both the 1930 and 1940 outcomes and the 2 periods difference, I'm going to show you the effect of being a World War I veteran in 1940, so after the bonus, with some 95% confidence intervals. So what you'll see is that veterans are about 3% more likely to own their home. This accounts for roughly 30% of the overall, 3 percentage points, 30% of the overall increase in homeownership in this sample. So this is explains roughly the same amount of variation as the GI Bill does, but it is a smaller effect. And amongst pairs of men who own their houses in both periods, they're going to have higher value homes. I'm going to skip this. We could talk about that later if people want. The other thing I want to show you here is that these effects are really dependent on what your housing market looked like and whether or not you owned your home. So men who lived in particularly bad hit housing markets in the 1930s, these are going to be men in the Q1 of this, it's like a county distribution of house price growth, are going to be the ones where the veterans are going to have the biggest effects on home ownership. So weak housing markets, veterans do the best. And it's in strong housing markets where they're actually able to leverage that to buy higher value homes. So they're outcompeting on 2 different margins here. And these effects are going to be largest for men who were renters previously. So this, to me, is like a bat signal that we should really care about home ownership here when we're thinking about why there are these long-term changes. And it turns out, if you look at mortgage loans, you'll see that veterans are disproportionately likely to get loans in the immediate aftermath of the bonus. So this is the share of veteran loans in Baltimore that are made sort of over time compared to non-veterans. You'll see most of these are early. The interesting thing, you can see this in a regression too, but we've all probably seen enough regressions in our lives. And then you can actually look and compare these men to other borrowers. They look worse, right? Veterans look worse than other FHA borrowers. And in fact, relative to other sort of the pool of eligible men for buying a house, the veteran effect is 2/3 as big as race. It's about half the sample mean in terms of the probability of owning a home, of getting a loan amongst linked data. So that tells us that these are men who are not looking great on observables. They get these loans right after the bonus is paid out. And the World War I veteran effect is super important for explaining why it is they're able to get a loan overall. The last thing I want to say, because I feel like I'm probably about out of time, is that these effects still exist in 1960. So unlike the previous paper, I have no fancy data. This part is actually just the cross-section of men in 1960, same age cohort. So Katie, birth cohort here. So this is a birth cohort. And what you'll see is that World War I veterans are maybe still more likely to own their home. But what's interesting is the homes they own are higher in value, and that grows with the size of the post-war housing boom. And so what that suggests is that the ability of these veterans to leverage this windfall gain to buy a home maybe had some pretty persistent effects, right? In ways that are going to widen wealth inequality instead of narrow it because of when they were able to buy these houses. So I'm on my conclusion slide, and I just want to say I'm happy to talk about this at length, but basically I want to just say that income shocks are important not only because they affect individuals' housing outcomes, but they interact with the state of the housing market and the weakness in credit markets in particular in this period to create these longer run effects over time. So I'll stop there. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And now Dan Fetter is going to. Thanks very much, Sarah. And now Dan Fetter is going to.
Says I can't start screen share while the other participant is sharing.
Join us.
Sorry, Dan.
One moment. One moment. All right, do you see that? Can anyone? Good. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, so thank you for having me, and I'm sorry not to see everyone in person, but those of you who know me know that I'm always game to talk about veterans and housing in the mid-20th century. So it's a pleasure to discuss this paper. Just to describe kind of what I see as the key takeaways from this paper. So I would say, first, it says, compared to non-veteran 1930 neighbors, veterans are more likely to own in 1940 conditional on ownership. They own higher valued houses. Consistent with that, kind of a major mechanism there being relaxation of liquidity constraints, which certainly, I'm inclined to think were important in the post-war housing boom. This affects the likelihood of entering into homeownership as well as the likelihood of retaining ownership. And, that's a particular note given the latter is a particular note given foreclosures and kind of the overall decreasing homeownership of the 1930s. I was really interested to see the evidence of crowding out of non-veterans in the mortgage market. To the extent that that's the case, it's sort of reducing the degree to which the veterans bonus raised aggregate rates of home ownership over the 1930s. And I found that interesting, especially, it's, in that different context, it certainly, it contrasts with at least the evidence that I'm inclined to, the evidence that I see in the post-World War II period when, if anything, I read the evidence as saying that the post-World War II veterans benefits crowded in home ownership for non-veterans. And then finally, that there were persistent differences between veterans and non-veterans in their 60s in 1960. So I have two main comments about the current version of this paper. First is that what I think is particularly cool about this paper is the ability to cut by 1930 housing and location characteristics to look at questions about heterogeneity, the effects by 1930 tenure status, by likely initial income, by local housing markets. All of those things are really cool. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that and, probably could be pushed on even further. But what's in the paper already, I found very interesting. My second comment is that most of the paper is based on a direct comparison or direct comparisons of veterans to non-veterans. And I think that remains problematic, even conditional on residing in the same 1930 neighborhood. And I'll say upfront, I don't actually doubt at all that the 1940 effects are there, but I think the paper could do more to establish those with greater confidence. And so, think about this question of whether comparisons of veterans to non-veterans in the same neighborhood would address selection concerns. The first thing I would say is that draft selection itself certainly was not random. On top of that, I would say it's kind of hard to sign the bias, even if we knew that the selection in the draft was positive. The first reason is that I think the bias for homeownership may not be in the same direction over the entire life cycle. So if you look in modern data, if you sort of compare college graduate, post-World War II data and sort of look at college graduates and non-college graduates, the college graduates are less likely to own earlier in life and more likely to own later in life. And sort of in other contexts, there seems to be some evidence that positively selected, higher human capital people or sort of higher earnings potential people will tend to own at lower rates early on in their lives and at greater rates later in their lives. And so, I think some caution is merited in thinking about what direction the bias ought to go, depending on where you are on the life cycle. The second reason on top of that is that if veterans are a selected subset of the population, but they live in the same location as non-veterans in 1930, you wonder what unobservables may be different between them that's driving them to live in the same location, even though one group is more positively selected than the others. And so the current version of the paper makes an effort to address those kinds of concerns, but I think more that can be done. When I look, for example, at this balance check table in the appendix, and I, while agreeing that, many of these things are economically small, it still raises some questions in my mind about whether we couldn't do better. And I think we could, certainly as a supplement at the very least. And in particular, the past literature that's looked at World War I veterans, my own paper where I kind of did it as a robustness check of sorts. And then, Weir and Tan's paper, I found to be an excellent approach to this. Focuses basically entirely on these cross-cohort comparisons. And I think the lack of differences that those papers find and other papers find in 1930 between veterans and non-veterans is a statement about cross-cohort comparisons and not within cohort comparisons. And so here's a graph that I made with the data that was available to us in the dark ages long ago. And here, I was trying to argue that there were no effects of veteran status on homeownership, and you see a big gap in veteran status across, these two birth cohorts, and a pretty modest effect, sort of basically zero difference in homeownership in 1930, which sort of persuades me that sort of anything that happened up to 1930, there was little causal effect of veteran status on these housing outcomes. And if you do the same thing in 1940, so this is not doing it as well as you could, this is just pulling down the 1% 1940 sample, you see evidence or you see something that, although it would be nice if this particular data point would cooperate, you see something that looks like something happened between 1930 and 1940 that kind of made the effect of veteran status change a fair amount over those 10 years. And sort of the bonus seems like definitely the most plausible candidate. So there's some approach like this that ought to work. I'll add that I didn't look at housing values. I did pull home ownership from the 1960 census. In there it seems a little bit less clear that there was something going on with home ownership by the time these men were in their 60s in 1960. But this is the sort of thing that could be done better, and I think would be a really good addition to what the paper is currently doing. And it needn't be that sort of crude thing that I did a long time ago. There are different versions of this. One which I would regard as less preferable at this point, given the data we have now, is kind of using the more continuous variation across cohorts. I've never sort of fully appreciated, or I've never fully agreed with everything that comes out of those models, but they're useful. Even better than that is what Weir and Tan managed to do in this explorations paper in 2020. And he linked data from 1900 to 1930 and used a proper regression discontinuity framework, and just sort of was able to do a lot with those kinds of things. Now, I would sort of regard that as the best approach if it's feasible in this sample. I think that could well be tricky in small neighborhood comparisons, but I would expect that it would be more feasible in larger units like cities or counties. In addition, he looks at economic outcomes in 1960 using sort of regression discontinuities, there's information I didn't use in the graph I just showed you, using quarter of birth. And that should definitely be feasible in this paper. And I think that would be, again, a really valuable contribution to this, addition to this paper. Other comments I'll skip over. They're kind of minor and not worth talking about in a discussion. And I'll just summarize by saying, first, I think those selection issues between veterans and non-veterans, I think should be addressed, but I also think they definitely can be addressed. And then finally, I think this is a cool and promising paper, and I'm excited to see what happens with it.
Dan, thank you very much for your comments, and Sarah for your paper. And now we've got time. I don't see anything in the chat box. We do have time for questions from the audience, and we've got first the gentleman here on the left, and then the lady immediately following. I feel like I'm at an auction, but please join us. Let me mute this while you talk. For our Zoom audience, the first question was about whether or not those same vets had purchased cars, and that might influence the housing situation. And our second question, go right ahead.
Hi there. So my
One more question. Go ahead, Price.
So one thing I was interested in was that they had a surge of loans that you mentioned earlier on, which is a sizable chunk of money. And so I wonder if there is a surge in, if there's a way to identify a surge in housing purchases with kind of cross-sectional data in 1933 to 35. I may have the data actually to help you at least check it with averages. So.
Thanks, Sarah. Go right ahead.
okay. First of all, that was all very helpful. Thank you. So to Dan's point, I have always dreamed of running an RD, and you've just given me permission, so I will absolutely be doing that. And I'll think a little bit more about how I can address this cross-cohort selection. The only thing I have right now in the paper I'll say is I look at the people who only become eligible in sort of September 1918, so they never serve on the front or anything like that. So there's like, that's not quite cross-cohort, but it's going to be people who are really only drafted. So I'll spend a little more time thinking about that and making an RD hard. So on this question of where they're moving, so it's interesting. So almost all the effects that you see actually for owners, a lot of it's being driven by men that I can absolutely identify removing. And so that suggests that very little of this is being driven by home improvements or anything like that. These men are trading up. And if you look at men, basically where you can match their addresses in 1940 to 1930, they're moving to places that are better census tracts, higher 1930 average home value census tracts. And they're moving, to look at the addresses, they're moving to places that have higher values in 1930. And so that would certainly be commensurate with the idea that they're leveraging this either because they can buy the house or because of the sort of the nature of where they're moving. I hadn't thought about it in terms of suburbs, only because I hadn't thought about suburbs in the 30s as much as sort of post World War II, but I should absolutely think about whether or not I can. Yeah, I guess I should. Yeah, so I'll have to spend some time thinking through the destination thing. On Rowena's point, I think on the housing supply front, right? Like it's just like people don't want to buy. From my understanding, is people don't want to build houses, so people are sort of stuck in the very derelict type situations until they have the ability to move. And so I think there is sort of this joint tightness of housing supply and credit supply. And the reason I'm sort of thinking about this maybe more on a credit supply margin is because of the FHA loans, which are going to be more targeted certainly towards it. You see these margins happening for loans that are most likely going towards new houses, new construction, because they're FHA loans, and because I have the mortgage data. But I should think a little bit more, perhaps using what Price suggested with the real property or whatever, some sort of way to look at sort of changes in house prices. I know Josh's paper found that there's a spike in building permits, so in 1936, so there might be some other stuff. Okay. Yeah. So the mortgage, yeah, there's also this, so to Price's point about that. So these are mortgage, these are specifically these are mortgage loans. So there is always this home improvement channel, but I don't see any evidence. So among men who stay in their own house, the veterans have no difference in their home value. So it doesn't seem to be operating.
Thank you very much. Let's give them another round of applause. And in the spirit of our technically challenged session tonight, I'm going to draw on my father's Air Force veteran comments about foam the runway. We're going to land this thing. Can we please have Gabe Mathy come on up from American University and give us his talk, and we'll hear, then his discussion will be Price Fishback. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to talk to you today about the Huey Long Spending Program and Fiscal Multipliers in the Great Depression. This is joint work with Vasudeva Ramaswamy, who's an AU grad student, who's an equal partner in this project. So this is a fun project. It's always fun to talk about Huey Long, but let's talk a little bit about fiscal multipliers. So there's been a lot of work done on fiscal multipliers in the Depression. And so, the man on the street kind of thinks about the New Deal as a period of fiscal policy, but economic historians know that's not really the case. Some other authors like Hausman and Hausman et al. Have looked at cross-sectional spending multipliers in the Depression and found kind of significant results. During the overall 20th century, the evidence is kind of a weaker multipliers. Brunet finds a multiplier of about 0.2 during World War II. And then the work that's kind of closest to this looks at New Deal spending, Fishback, Horace, and Cantor, and they find about 44 cents more retail spending from New Deal spending. And Fishback and Kachnovskaya find a multiplier of a little bit below 1 at the state level. And in modern periods, you find kind of larger multipliers, about 1.7 to 1.8. So that means that if you spend $1, you're going to get about 1.7 or $1.8 of additional GDP. So what does this paper do? Well, we're going to look at a very specific case of a state level spending program during the Depression in Louisiana. And so this has several benefits. It's going to be one of the only programs that starts in 1929. A lot of the other programs are later in the 30s. It's going to be a state level treatment. So we're going to have a control because the spending's done at the state level. And so we don't have to look at cross-sectional variation in a national program. We're getting a pretty big spike in spending. And we can even look at tax multipliers. So we're going to have some evidence on taxes too. And also Louisiana as a state is one member of a currency union, so we don't have to worry about any kind of monetary offset. Though in the Depression, that's probably not a big concern. So in terms of our results, we find multipliers of roughly 1. It's going to depend on the different ways we look at it.
Professor Mathy,
yes.
Real quick, I'm sorry, but I don't think your slides are being presented on the Zoom.
Oh, they're not. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. That's right, because we turned off the share. Thank you. Sorry about that. Still getting used to Zoom after a year and a half. All right, so Huey Long is going to win the 1928 election, and he's a kind of populist leader in the style of kind of Hugo Chavez. So he's going to be very popular, but without any kind of scruples about checks and balances or anti-corruption efforts. So he's going to start by trying to ram through his promises, which involve a pretty large spending program, and he's going to get through that despite an impeachment attempt. And so he's really going to increase spending a lot in Louisiana. So you can see here, the red bar is going to be the increase from 1929 to 1931 in Louisiana spending. So they go from about average to being about twice the average, and they're the largest spending state in 1931 of the whole country, including traditionally high spending states in the north. And so the growth from those 2 years is going to be more than 100%. So you can see it really dwarfs any other state, and a lot of states are cutting back in the midst of the Depression. And so in terms of looking at different states, we can look at the report on state finances, and you see that some states like Tennessee and Texas are going to be cutting, while Louisiana is going to double things. And so we see some evidence from 29 to 31 that this is going to cushion the depression. So in general, Louisiana is going to see milder declines from 29 to 31 when the spending is really ramping up, but we don't really see a big difference by 33 when the spending ramps down. And so if we look at kind of real income declines with Louisiana and similar neighboring states, we're going to see that they have the lowest decline in real income from 29 to 31. So just to give you some kind of preliminary results from that early data. So Huey Long is going to have a big road program. His rural base really wants roads. There's real need in Louisiana. And he's a good politician, so he's going to build roads in almost every parish. So counties in Louisiana are parishes. So you can see even a lot of these north-south linkages, which don't make much sense, say Shreveport South or east of Shreveport going north-south. Those don't make a lot of sense, but they're going to be part of the plan to make sure that every parish has a road. But once Huey Long gets elected to the Senate, then he's going to kind of lose interest. So we're going to get some variation because once he's achieved that objective, he's going to lose interest in spending as much in Louisiana. So the dream was for Louisiana to rule the world in terms of having the best roads across the globe. But the reality is that the spending is really going to ramp down. So you can see this big spike from 29 to 31, and then a big ramping down through 33. Later on, we're going to see there's going to be a little bit of a spike later around 36, but it's much smaller. And almost all of this is kind of state highway spending. So there's also a free textbook program that we look at. Huey Long is going to give out free textbooks to kids, but the spending is much smaller. So it's only about $1.50 per pupil per year, whereas spending on school transportation only for white students is going to be about $20 per student. So this is going to increase spending, but not all that much. And there's also an adult literacy program, primarily for older African Americans that had been formerly slaves. And that spending, while necessary, is pretty small too. So this is only about $300,000. So Huey Long is going to be assassinated. So you might say the paper is unfairly titled, but his political faction is going to continue to rule after his assassination. And so those around him, while Huey Long is fighting with FDR, those around Huey Long are going to make peace with Roosevelt, and that's going to increase federal funding. So New Deal spending is going to really increase, and that's that increase around 1936. And so Huey knows that he needs to be the boss to keep people out of prison, that his underlings are going to go too wild with the corruption, and he's right. So once he passes away, then there's going to be these famous Louisiana scandals, and a lot of the Long machine are going to end up in prison. And then by 1941, the anti-Long forces are going to win in Louisiana. So we're going to use this episode to try and think about how corruption interacts with fiscal multipliers. So here's what spending looks like as a percent of Louisiana's personal income. And so you can see that big increase through about 1932. And then there's another increase later on with that second Louisiana purchase when the federal government's going to give a lot more money to Louisiana. And then we had trouble getting information on taxes. We got all the state fiscal reports, but they don't really break out the taxes. So this is aggregated property taxes. And so that's why they're declining, because you're getting some other taxes coming online. And so you can see that the educational spending is not varying all that much. That's the red line. But the green line of road spending is really varying a lot in per capita terms. And then property taxes, there's not a whole lot of variation. So these results are a bit weaker, but we try to look at these local property tax variations. So in terms of a simple theory of fiscal multipliers, you might expect that it's going to be higher in terms of with a time of more slack, like the Great Depression, when you have more unemployment. In a more closed economy, more spending is going to circulate locally rather than leaking outside. If you have more liquidity constrained households or lower income households, or if you have direct spending rather than transfers. And so 2 is going to be important in Louisiana because it's a small state. And so a lot of the spending is going to leak out. Tradability obviously matters a lot for the multiplier. And so we're going to try to think about different tradability of different goods. And so we have some evidence on 100% traded industries like cotton and corn, some non-traded industries like retail sales. And then we have some other mostly non-traded industries that could be tradable, but often aren't very far, like manufactured ice and milk. So this is our parish level road projects. And so we digitized all the Department of Transportation reports and looked at all the different projects. looked at how many miles they were, how much the spending was. And so this is what the road projects look like. And so this is how spending varies relative to over time. And so you can see it's really big in 29 to 33. You're getting some in 33 to 35 and 35 to 39, but it's really ramped down a lot. And then the lower chloroplasts are retail sales. And so you can see that it's kind of varying across the state. There's big differences between North and South Louisiana. We don't really see that in terms of the retail sales growth all that strongly. So here's our regression. So we're going to look at retail sales since it's mostly non-traded and it tends to correlate with a business cycle. So we base that on Fishback, Horace, and Cantor. And so here we're going to look at the overall spending from these periods 29 to 33, 33 to 35, and 35 to 39, since that's when we have retail sales, to try and think about how the total spending in that period affects the growth rate of retail sales. So we get a positive coefficient on road building and education and a -1 on tax collection. And so if you translate that into per capita retail sales, you get about 57 or 60 cents, and then tax collection is pretty negative. And then we also have controls for things like the New Deal for the AAA and public works and relief at the federal level. So we've got some fixed effects in there, obviously, too. Those fixed effects are going to soak up some of those period effects. So we get some results, on road building, the statistical significance is pretty small. And then we look specifically at the 29 to 33 period. And there we get kind of similar magnitudes, so a little bit higher, and we lose statistical significance on education. But we're getting kind of roughly a 60 cent or 70 cent change in response to these variables. And so you might worry that, given Huey Long's corruption and political savvy, you might worry that there's some targeting. Maybe he's spending a lot more in poor counties and poor parishes where his base is located. So we think that it's likely actually that he's kind of randomizing since he's spending a little bit in every parish. It's going to cause some exogenous variation in per capita spending. But we try to use an instrumental variables approach to deal with these concerns. So we assume that even if Huey allocated things non-optimally, by 2018, we'd expect the state highway network has evolved to kind of reflect the overall state's needs and not specific factors that Huey was trying to optimize over. And then with education, we use 1927 education spending and also a literacy, since we have those literacy programs that maybe there was targeting there. We also have New Deal spending, so we use the same instruments as before to try and instrument for that. And we brought them back to 1920 when we were able to, since they were for a little bit later period. And so with our instruments, we get kind of similar results. So, the magnitudes are similar. Thank you, 4 minutes. And so we're kind of heartened by that the results are somewhat similar with the instruments. So here's our overall multipliers table. And so, it's varying a little bit. We're getting roughly 1. So, we convert our retail sales. We use the ratio of retail sales to income to get an overall multiplier. And so we're getting roughly 1. So we look also at agricultural multipliers as a kind of falsification test. So what's the multiplier on cotton? The whole crop is exported. Since there's no cotton mills in Louisiana, and we also look at corn and milk. Milk's not very tradable. And so for cotton, we get a very small number. So we get that if you spend more on roads, you get about 2 pounds less of cotton per parish. So overall, we're getting pretty precise zeros for these tradable industries. Corn and milk are a little bit less precise zeros. So I'm running low on time. So we think these multipliers are a bit low relative to what modern studies have found. And so we think about some reasons why that might be. And so one reason is that we kind of speculate about corruption here. This is a highly corrupt system in Louisiana. And so previously some studies have used corruption to try and identify multipliers. But we try to think about how that might affect both measurement errors and the actual multiplier. And so if you have corruption, you're going to move funds from kind of more constrained households to very wealthy, corrupt individuals that might have a lower MPC. And then it might also reduce the measured multiplier because you're going to be moving funds that are actually going to where the corrupt people live rather than where supposedly the spending is happening. And so we try to address the latter. So we have these indictments in the later period. And so we have some evidence of a 2% cut being taken. So that's how much graft there's going to be, and a 13% level of graft. And so we try to reallocate 2% from all parishes to these parishes where we think the corrupt people are located. So Baton Rouge is one location we think, and then Jefferson Parish is a suburb of New Orleans, where also a lot of the indicted live. So these are the parishes where they live. And so we try to do this reallocation and see what happens with the multiplier. And so for 29 to 33, we find at a 2% level of graft if we reallocate that away from those larger parishes, and we get a slightly larger multiplier. So we think that maybe this corruption effect might be lowering the multiplier. 13% is too high. So this is highly speculative, but we just wanted to introduce this idea, and hopefully more work can be done on this topic. So how much time do I have? A minute? Okay, I should probably finish up. So we think illiteracy in Louisiana might also be a reason why the multiplier is low, because you get bottlenecks where you don't have highly skilled workers. And then Louisiana doesn't produce a lot of things that you might need for roads, like iron or steel products. They're just doing simple processing of commodities. So that's going to increase how much you have to import because manufacturing capacity is so low in Louisiana. All right, so I don't have time for the state level results, kind of weak anyway. So let me just conclude. So, we looked at fiscal multipliers in depression. We found multipliers of about 1, kind of speculated on corruption dismultipliers. Hopefully others can work more on this. In terms of future work, we want to look more at LSU. So Louisiana State is involved in this corruption and is involved in a lot of spending. Huey is really lavish there. But I have to find the reports on LSU specifically. Think about how debt and interest matter. Try to collect gas taxes, because that's a big way that road spending was funded, and then try to separate out tax revenue by source. So that's future work. Thanks so much for your attention. You don't want me to stop sharing?
No, just leave it. All right. I'm going to actually use it. So I thoroughly enjoyed reading this paper. So about 12, 13 years ago, I embarked on this attempt. John Wallis and I and Teresa Gabriel embarked upon this attempt to actually try to figure out what was going on with state governments during the 1930s. So we went out and tried to collect all this information for the entire states, because it turned out the financial statistics of the states, they reported information about what was going across the states, and up to 1931, stopped and then started again in 1937. In the middle, there was a revolution going on in the states. I mean, the states do all sorts of changes, new sales taxes, new income taxes, new everything. Introduce alcohol and all sorts of things like that. So one of the things I always thought is that one of the most important things that everybody seems to have missed about what was going on in the 1930s was how the states responded to the Great Depression and how they responded also to the New Deal. And so Gabe's actually scooped us by looking at what's going on in probably the most interesting state of any one you can look at, which is Louisiana, Missouri. I don't know where that came from. But anyway, I want to compliment Gabe also on being able to pronounce Valentina Kuchinevskaya correctly on his first attempt. So that was really great. So that was, okay, well, that's good. But look, most people can practice for days and still not do it. So I was really impressed with that. So what Gabe does is he's looking at retail sales primarily. Also, he does some stuff with the states. You don't find very much in those state results, primarily because you only have like 10 observations. And so there's just not much you can get out of that. Valentina actually did try to estimate individual state multipliers for each one, and that was a mess. So we gave up on that pretty quickly. But it's really interesting looking at Louisiana, particularly at that period, 1929 to 1931, because Huey Long is a populist big time. I don't think he's Hugo Chavez, I've got to say. So, but this was a period where a lot of other states were cutting back and doing things like this, and Huey is out there spending. And so we get a pretty good picture of what's going on. And the biggest problem that Gabe runs into is you don't really have a good measure of what's happening in 1931 across the parishes, which is what you'd really like to have. So you can still rely on 33, though. And so he talks a lot about two particular programs that are important. One is the road building program, which they really have a huge surge during that period. I have one question about that is that how much federal money came in that period? Was there a sudden surge in those 2 years or not? Yeah. Well, actually, they expand quite a bit. So you need to double check. I think I've got some numbers for you on that. And also the program to break illiteracy and stuff. And so these are serious attempts, even though Huey is kind of a corrupt guy and he's doing all sorts of things. He actually is trying to help the poor guy in a lot of different ways. He's providing jobs for a lot of people, things along those lines. And so Gabe's basically trying to estimate the short run effects, but he's also trying to pick up what happens 33 to 35 when you actually have some recovery going on, 35 to 39 where you have the recovery, then the dip, and then the recovery again. The one issue I have for him on the econometrics is I think he was trying to match up with what we were trying to do at the time in terms of when we were doing the retail sales paper. We had this thing where in the retail sales paper, what we did was we looked at percent change in retail sales on one side, and then we looked at what we consider to be the change in federal government spending. But the way we wrote it in the equation, it was the level of federal government spending. And so Gabe is looking at the change in retail sales, but then he's looking at the level of what's going on at that time frame, and he probably should be looking at the change in there. And one reason I suggest that is that if he doesn't look at the change on the right-hand side, he should probably include across the Paris fixed effects. Just to be similar, if he wants to compare to what we were doing. He gets interesting results. He gets pretty similar multipliers to what we get. I'm a little worried about making the conversion from retail sales to income. We did that because we couldn't do it regularly until Valentina and I wrote the paper later on. So, but actually, I think it's a useful way to compare things, just to make sure to emphasize that you actually are scaling with the 0.55. But these are fascinating things. And you just look at this road spending per capita on this that you see, there's just a huge surge there. The education spending is not really reflecting the literacy thing. So Gabe is matching up to the kind of the econometric literature on multipliers. But in some ways, I'd like to get him to shift. I don't know if I should actually advise him to do this because, this would make it turn him more to an historian than an economist, which may not be a good thing in his situation. But there's so many interesting things about what's going on with Huey Long at this time period that actually focusing in more specifically on the two programs and trying to see if you can find other relationships and maybe even more institutional features might actually be useful. Because we know so little about what's going on. So it'd be more like a economic history paper than trying to be in the economics paper. But the big thing is in the economics side, though, is the literacy effect and the road effect. When you're doing the multipliers, that's just a 1 year multiplier. And I talked to him about this before. The literacy effect's going to keep on giving for quite some time. And so in some ways, you might want to look at the 40 census or look at the 50 census and see. Now, he does some preliminary comparisons and you don't see much. And so maybe the textbook thing's just not doing the job. But on the road side in particular, they're building pieces of roads and all sorts of things like this in that year because they're trying to fill in the network, but it's going to take some time. And so in a lot of ways, some of the big bang from the roads may not come until 1939. And so one of the things he does a panel for 29 to 33, 33 to 35, 35 to 39. And then he does a comparison just for 29 to 33. But actually, I think making the comparison from 29 to 39 is actually pretty useful in these contexts. So you can get a picture of the long run picture of things. And I got to say, these are a great selection of slides. So I hope they're on my computer, so I'm going to steal them to use in lectures and things like that. But it really is. It's a fascinating paper. It's definitely worth a good read. There's some things you can fix, but it's really gone a long way towards getting at the issues.
Okay, let's see. We've got a couple of things in the chat, so let me open with that, and then we'll go to questions from the floor. Okay, they're just asking for sharing the slides. They just want more and more. Okay, so Katherine Eriksson and No, that was, well then, sorry. Maybe those, maybe I read those over there and I'm seeing from second time up here. All right, so anything from the floor? Any questions anyone's got to, go ahead, Matt. On down. And let's see, did I hear a chime? Did someone ask? Question.
Yes, my question about this is just really, the other thing that's going on in Louisiana during this period is you have the Great Flood. So we know it wipes out large portions of Louisiana, and they're rebuilding levees, but also rebuilding roads around things that were got destroyed. So it's some of this stuff, especially with the night, I'd be a lot more worried if it was 28 to 33, but even 29, they're just starting to ramp up because Red Cross spending, national relief spending is ramping down. I mean, it's also possibly politics leading to this election in the first place. So especially with a lot of migration stuff that's been, I know a lot of banks close all during that period. So it'd be interesting to kind of pull that out at least as a control. You have a
For those of you on Zoom who might not have heard Matt Jaremski's question, he was bringing up the fact that there was a great flood in the state of Louisiana, the recovery from which might have impacted some of the results. Sorry. Go ahead, Gabe.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. We need to do more on the Great Flood, especially with the pre-trends, because I think there's some stuff going on there. We tried to look at the levee districts, but some of the levee boards are also a great place for so both before
What else have we got? Come on. Great.
So I really enjoyed this, but I think I'd like you to think a little more about kind of the political economy of the spending, because I'm really surprised that you would get the same multiplier on the highway spending as on the education, because they're being funded totally different ways, right? Highway spending is out of the capital budget where the state can borrow and issue bonds. And education spending is out of the operating budget where they're constrained year to year by tax revenue. So, that, unless it's a redistribution within the state, I really want you to think about those channels and how is this on net being paid for? And is it a redistribution of spending rather than relative to tax burdens across counties? Is that what's going on at the education? Or, because I would really expect something much closer to zero on the education, given that binding constraint on borrowing at a time when state revenues are very weak, versus they can borrow to fund the highways. And so that you would think would be much more expansionary. And so thinking hard about kind of what are the margins for funding and what's going on there, I think this would be really helpful.
I think that's a really good point. We were a bit surprised, I think, that the multipliers were so similar, that the education really just, there's not as much variation, much less. We do control for property taxes, which is parish level spending is coming from. So I don't know if having that tax in and not having the gas taxes matter. But I think we do need to dig deeper.
Thank you very much. Anything else from the floor? I don't see, let me check the chat room one more time. Any comments from Gabe's co-author on Zoom?
Not at the moment, just very thankful for all the comments and the suggestions as well. We'll be looking further into those. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would, before we end, I want to just give a shout out to Sin Wang, Price's grad assistant or grad assistant from Arizona, for helping us get set up at the very beginning. Thank you very much, Sin. Thanks, Price. Thanks, everybody. I am going to leave the meeting, everybody on Zoom. Thanks for joining us. It was great having you.